Welcome to the AI Show, Auckland's monthly AI event. This month we hosted a special event focusing on enterprise-grade platforms to enable secure LLMs and Gen AI applications. Our next presentation is from Steve Naude, the Chief AI Officer for SmartSpace.ai and AI New Zealand.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Steve Naude. I am from SmartSpace. I'm the Chief AI Officer there. I am also the AI Transformation Lead at Fonterra and Chief AI Officer at New Zealand AI. I help them out with a few things as well. So today I'm going to talk to you about implementing Gen AI in the enterprise. I'll get to what SmartSpace does at the end, but first I want to talk through a bunch of risks and misconceptions that are associated with generative AI in general. So people think it's original. It's not. Statistically, as we described earlier, it predicts the likely sequence of text given a bunch of words. It doesn't understand words, actually. It relies on pattern recognition within those that sequence of text. It is not creative by any means. And generally, it's plagiaristic because, considering the fact that it's trained on vast amounts of text data, essentially it just tries to copy that. It is not conscious. We're not going to die. We're all okay. It has no intent. It has no perception of understanding. It has no EQ. It is not accurate. In fact, it has zero concept of truth. We'll talk a little bit about truth in an upcoming slide. It relies on data and plausibility of that data, specifically the plausibility of the words that follow the words that it originates from. It does need human verification, so wherever possible, you always need to introduce a human in the loop practice. And age-old adage, garbage in, garbage out, it's still true. It is not unbiased. It 100% reflects the bias that is present in the training data. It can even be overbiased by ethical AI, wokeness as I call it. I'll give you an example of that a little bit later. Much like garbage in, garbage out, it's bias in, bias out as well. And one of the questions I like to ask organizations that I work with is, specifically for customer-facing use cases, is, are you comfortable with it representing your organization? And I use the Canada Air example, where someone asked if they were eligible for a refund, and it said, well, yeah, sure, why not? The company said, no, actually you're not. And then it went to court where, Canada Air said, well, no, the AI said that. I didn't say that. They lost. It is in no way a self-learning organism. It is, the P in GPT stands for pre-trained. So obviously it is trained, it is parameter driven, it is a snapshot in time of the data and the training data that was used. It does not self-learn. The reason why I have that in italics is because people create experiences that are wrapped around these models that create the impression of it being able to self-learn, but it itself does not self-learn. And it is stateless. It has no working memory. And those of you that are familiar with ChatGPT, it kind of feels like it has a memory. Again, that's just a chat history that's being used that creates this perception or experience of memory. It is not self-directed. It's stateless. It is driven directly or 100% by input and output. It is in a permanent wait state. It is an API waiting for you to send it an instruction. Completely reactive, lacks adaptation, and driven by user input. Simple? Probably not. Most people think that, well, it's just an API, right? Just call an API, get an answer, job done. No. What about responsible AI? What about data governance? We spoke about garbage in, garbage out. It is non-deterministic, meaning that you ask the same question, you're probably going to get a different answer. There are ways to prevent against that, temperature being one of them. But by nature, it is non-deterministic. And really, for me, everything Gen AI is all about the experience. It's all about what do you wrap around that simple API call, as we call it. And we'll talk through some of those things as this goes on. So I've wrapped or circled no concept of truth, because that's what I want to talk about in my next few slides. So I'll start by saying that in 1977, two Pennsylvania-based universities did a study on truth. And they came to the conclusion that people are more likely to identify something as truthful if they've heard it before. Now, AI models are kind of similar, that they are likely to identify something as truthful if they've been trained on it or processed that data before. So what are models trained on? What types of data do they use? Now, there's two main types of data. You get corpus data. Now, this is all the training data that the big organizations put together. Generally, they scrape it off the internet. It includes general knowledge and, importantly, copyrighted data. We see OpenAI in court with the New York Times at the moment on the problem that they've created is that in New York Times, essentially they've set up a paywall. So you go there, you want to read an article, you've got to subscribe, you've got to pay. Now, if you ask the right questions in ChatGPT, you can actually get that same information for free. So New York Times don't like that very much. It is extended by fine-tuning, so you can create a set of prompts and completions and fine-tune a model to create more or outputs that better reflect your expectations. That is a huge risk, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a further slide. It is limited by parameter counts, cutoff dates, and essentially as a user or even as a developer, you pretty much have zero control over the data that has been trained on. On the other side of the fence, we get prompt data. So it is used as contextual data. So if specifically in an organization, if a user asks a question, you generally go and search for context to answer that question and include it in your prompt. So it includes organizational, confidential data. You can extend it by functions, tools, agents, GPTs. It's limited by the size of the context windows that you work with each of these models, and your search capabilities, your ability to go and fetch the context that you need to add into your prompt. And essentially, you have 100% control of that type of data query time. Now, corpus data, we've established as training data that's scraped off the internet. There's an article that came out that said AI experts predict that by 2026, 90% of all online content will be generated by AI. So essentially, we're using proportionally more AI-generated content to train the next iteration of each AI model that's coming out. Then there's articles that are coming out saying, well, ChatGPT is getting worse over time. I have a theory. Essentially, what I'm saying, though, is we are relying more and more on the prompt data than we are on the corpus data, on the training data. The training data is allowing these models to have this sort of intelligence that we call it. But the corpus, the prompt data is what's adding the context and the ability to answer our organizational questions. One of the risks of bringing your own model or even training your own model, I referenced the Bloomberg GPT model. It was all the rage back in March 2023. They released a paper. They spent estimated $10 million US training this model. They were going to pretty much just print money from this. And 6 months later, there was an article that came out that said GPT 3.5 and 4 essentially outperformed Bloomberg GPT, which meant that they flushed $10 million down the drain. So the question I have to you is, do you have the budget, expertise, compute, availability that you're willing to throw at something like this? And then are you willing to be classified as a provider in the eyes of the EU Act, the EU AI Act? Which probably not. From a fine-tuning perspective, I love the slide. So I went to Redmond in November for an AI tour, and this was one of the slides that they used. And essentially what they did was they took 140,000 Slack messages from a particular user, and they fine-tuned a model using that. And they said, well, write me a 500-word blog post on prompt engineering. It said, sure, I'll do it in the morning. And then stopped. I said, no, write it now. And they said, well, okay. And then did nothing. And essentially the model took on the behavior of the human. And this is a great example of what I said on my previous slide. Are you willing, because a substantial modification classifies you as a provider of such models, so are you willing to take on that risk? This is a very extreme example, but it's still an example. Be very careful when you fine-tune your models. Obviously, there's a potential liability here, and maybe even a new insurance product for the new startups in the room. So data weighting is all about, well, how much corpus data versus how much prompt data do models actually use? And I asked ChatGPT this, and it said that the context from your prompt can override general information from the training data when it's more relevant. So essentially the model will evaluate what is the type of question that you're asking. And if it knows no context from its training data, it will look for you to provide that context within the prompt. So we can effectively, in an organizational context, sway the models to use our prompt data. I'd like to conduct a little truth experiment here. So let's say you have a flashlight shining some light on the wall. Put a mystery object in its way, and you get that shadow on the wall. I'm not going to insult everyone's intelligence. I'm going to assume you think that's a square. I asked ChatGPT the same thing and said, well, it's square shaped. It's probably a box, a square plate, or even a piece of paper. Now, what if we take that object and we change it, and we get that shadow on the wall? Well, again, GPT said, yeah, it's triangular. Could be a prism, a pyramid, three-dimensional object with a triangular face. And lastly, if we get that shadow on the wall, well, yeah, got it right again. It's circular. It could be a ball, spherical shape. But then it started to kind of pick up on what I was doing here. And it said if the object were a different shape, such as a cylinder or a cube, the shadow would generally take on a different shape depending on the angle that you look at it from. All those shadows were essentially the same object. So now looking at it from this angle, that's a pipe that has been wedged from one end. I get a circle as a shadow. Looking at it from this angle, I get a square. And then looking at it from the top, I get a triangle. The whole point of this is that you need to give the models enough context that it fully understands the truth that you expect to receive as a response. The analogy I like to use, everyone's heard of explain like I'm 5. Is that picture your first day at school, sitting in front of the class, and the teacher writes up 1 + 1 = 2. And then he turns around and goes, what's 1 + 1? Everyone goes, 2! And you think you're super clever now. This is how you need to treat the models. Treat the models like they are 5. Ask a question, give it an open book test, and then you'll get a good answer. So the example I'm going to use, I have sleep apnea. And I asked ChatGPT, am I covered by my health insurance provider for a device? Now, disclaimer, I did tell it to be overly positive and always in agreement. And it said, well, yes, you're covered. Well, I'm not. But I didn't give it any context. I just asked the question and got an answer. So I can expect it to be hallucinating, right? So now let's try to give it an open book test. I went and I found my policy document, downloaded it, put it into ChatGPT, asked the same question. Now I get the right answer, saying that according to the benefit summary, there's actually an exclusion for CPAP devices. Notice I asked for sleep apnea and it associated CPAP with sleep apnea. Now, when you're actually doing chunking in the background, what is taking place? Well, there's the page from my document, my policy document, with the exclusions, and I've highlighted CPAP, which is what the model identified as contextually similar to my question. And then I take that and I ask the question and then paste in that exclusion list on the left-hand side. And essentially, that mimics the exact same answer that we got on the previous screen. Now let's assume we're doing this ourselves. How does RAG actually work? Well, let's talk it through. So there was my chunk of text that I put in as context. So now if I did this manually, I would conceptualize and understand the question. What am I actually asking for? I would do a Google search, find my policy document. I would access the document and the content therein. I would then perform a keyword search. So I'm now searching for sleep apnea. Well, I don't find anything. So then I semantically change my search from sleep apnea to CPAP because they're contextually similar. Now I find something. So I then highlight the text and copy that chunk of text and then paste it into my conversation with ChatGPT. Constructed the prompt and the query, and essentially then send it to the model. Those are all the fundamental steps that happen in the background when you're interacting with ChatGPT or any of the other applications that we've seen tonight. So the risk I'm highlighting here based on that is the experience for your users is almost entirely limited by your search capabilities and your ability to find the context that you need to answer the user's query. And that could be through a function, GPT tool, agent, whatever you'd like to call it. There's another risk that has come about from people using third-party search capabilities. And essentially, it is where instead of a response that contains your context, websites are providing responses that essentially do prompt injection attacks. So very much similar to the old SQL injection attacks. These websites are designed to put in text or words that alter the original system prompt and its instructions that are contained within, and rather do something else that they intend for you to do. So as an organization, you need to look at all of your accreditations, your security accreditations that you have, and assess any third-party tools or plugins or functions against those to make sure that they're fully compliant. And then also, Microsoft have released a product called Prompt Shields, which essentially uses, I forget the term now. It's on one of my future slides. I'll come back to it. But essentially, they use a delimiter, which then isolates the response that you expect to get from these plugins, which then allows any prompt injection attacks to be more identifiable should those delimiters not exist. Spotlighting, that's what it's called. So what happens when responsible AI becomes woke? Well, we'll just use the Google Gemini example, where someone asked it to produce a picture of Elon Musk, and that was the picture that was generated. Someone else asked it to produce an image of a Viking, and that's what came up. And then lastly, someone asked it to make an image of a 1943 German soldier, and that's what was produced. And in fact, Google themselves admitted to getting it wrong. They said, we're going to do better. But this is what happens when you turn those screws too tight on responsible AI. They had policies specifically in there to eliminate certain groups. Another risk is understanding the regional laws within the jurisdictions that you operate. Now, I didn't create these. All of these were created by a man named Oliver Patel. I think he is the responsible AI head at AstraZeneca, and he releases these quite regularly on LinkedIn. But for example, like at Frontera, China is one of the jurisdictions that we operate in. And this is exactly where I learned about their algorithm registry, they call it. And essentially it is a government-controlled registry that foundational model providers like OpenAI have to register their models with, and then as a user, you are only allowed to use models from that registry. And if you don't, you're in breach of law. And China is probably not a country you'd like to be in breach of law. So understand the regional laws within which you operate. It is crucial. US, they also have sent out a notice saying that the US Copyright Office explained that human authorship is required for copyright protection and that it will refuse to register works solely generated by AI. And that any material which is not the product of human authorship must be disclaimed in the registration application. So essentially, if you are using AI outputs and then trying to register those outputs for copyright, you cannot in the US. And anyone that decides to use that content, you're not protected. They can freely use it.
How would they know?
I guess, yeah, it's up for debate, but just understand your risks as an organization. Another one I'd like to call out is from ChatGPT themselves, in fact. The example I use. And again, this is a very extreme example, but it highlights another risk to make sure that your AI-generated content is audience appropriate. Now, a study was done on OpenAI that showed that almost 20% of global users are kids. Now, I'm pretty sure they have a policy that says you have to be 18 or whatever to use AI. What if you don't realize your user base and you generate content that is harmful or offensive? So you just need to be really clear around who is your audience and what are their expectations. What I've introduced at Frontiera is something I like to call an AI enrollment contract. This is overly simplified, but essentially what it starts with is a set of guiding principles, which should ideally be part of your AI policy. But these guiding principles need to be highlighted for any business use case that is coming forward for your committee or your TDA or whatever, your steer code that is set about there to approve the use of AI within any use cases of your organization. One part I've actually added, which is not on here, is just the business problem that you're trying to solve and what is your success criteria and how are you going to measure that. In terms of data requirements, very, very important. AI is pretty much nothing in an organizational context without data. So where is that source system? Where's the data that you're going to be using? How is it classified in terms of your use of the data? Do you need personal data, sensitive, confidential, internal, redacted, restricted, whatever other classifiers you have within your organization? Most importantly, the very last column of owner has to approve and sign off the use of that data in an AI context. And then you can also list any further redactions or restrictions that need to be applied before that data can be used. I've just put a sample bunch of questions there that you would generally ask. I like to call out point 3, which is, have you considered any impact on the workforce within your organization? And do you have plans to refocus or retrain any people that might be affected for many automated processes? Lastly, I'll call out the very last box on the bottom right-hand side. Every organization needs to have an AI compliance officer as much as they need a data privacy officer. When something goes wrong, you need a single point to reach out to say, hey, this is harmful content. We've offended somebody. We've allowed AI to make a decision on our behalf, like in the air, that caused chaos. Sent us to court. You need an AI compliance officer, and you need an AI compliance officer at companyabc.com, whatever your organization is, so that people have access to raise the alarm should they need to. I'm not going to go through this slide, it's very, very busy, but essentially what we've built or are building at both SmartSpace and Frontiera is this intelligent layer that takes the user's query and does a whole bunch of stuff in terms of that experience I spoke about earlier, that is augmented away from the user, but creates that seamless, really, really good experience. The first line is, we have, at Frontiera specifically, we have a right to operate. Like, has the user been through our Gen AI 101 training in terms of what it is, how to write a good prompt, much like they would have to go through the data privacy training. So do they have a right to operate? Have we managed privacy, confidentiality? And again, I'm not going to go through all this, but there's various steps that this intelligent query assistant seeks to solve. At the end, we've got the semantic cache, so this can deal with FAQs or questions that have been pre-approved by knowledge masters. So I forgot to mention that anything in italics is an opportunity for you to introduce people. And the white underlined words align with the Microsoft Responsible AI policy. Second line is, if you decide not to choose an answer from an FAQ or semantic cache, but you instead need to find the context you need to answer the user's query as well. Firstly, let's make sure we understand intent. NLU is a very new concept, which is where, for example, if you've got a HR-focused chatbot, it is the ability to start detecting situations that may occur from people giving you indications of potentially self-harm or negative sentiment, or they're about to do something stupid. It's the ability for you to have an alert system that can react, raise the alarm, hey, go and speak to this person. It's something we're introducing in our chatbots. And then lastly in that, we like to echo and confirm intent to make sure that we fully understand what the user is looking for. We then go and look for the context that we need through various tools, functions, whatever is available to us. We then rewrite the query before we actually conduct the search to make sure that it's perfectly aligned with the understanding of the technology that is used beneath that. That's where that spotlighting term came from that I couldn't remember earlier. And now we have the context that we need. So now we apply a whole bunch of other stuff like token intelligence, making sure that we limit token usage wherever possible. So we consider model selection and its context window limitations, the maximum tokens parameters that's been used, the system prompt directives. For example, you write me a 500-word blog post, you'd have to consider that 500-word instruction. Confidence threshold limits is where you essentially run a search and you have a percentage-based confidence rating that it has to meet, so you can further limit your search results that are used within context of your search or your prompts. And then prompt engineering, we'll know what that is. I won't speak about that. Prompt intelligence now is where you can potentially use, for example, multi-hop, break a complex task into micro steps and use GPT 3.5 to answer those steps versus sending that original user query to GPT-4 and paying for an expensive model and lots of tokens. And then what I wanted to call out here, and the reason why those two circles are different colors, is because that's what happens between the user submitting a query and you calling the API. It's all around that experience, safety, security, governance, to make sure that within your organization they have a great tool. And then some jurisdictions require for watermarking to be applied. And then lastly, you have the response evaluation, which takes us through to a whole other section of similar boxes, which then, after you've received a response from the model, you still need to make sure that it is inclusive, that the thought process can be explained, that it is fair, have specifically for certain use cases an SME that is accountable for the responses of those models, that it's fact-checked if possible, specifically for public or external data, have an opportunity for people to provide human feedback is really, really important. So have a policy where people get rewarded for feedback. Make sure that they have a mechanism to report abusive content or harmful content or offensive content. Simple thing like, active feedback buttons like ChatGPT does, up and down. Have the ability to provide optional comments. And also they allow them to report accessibility issues that they may experience that you've just never thought of. A very, very simple one is the interface and the font that you use in the interface. Some people just really battle to read certain fonts. I know I do. So allow them to tell you that. And then lastly, make sure you understand all the laws, copyright issues, regional laws, all that affects your use of AI within your organization. So getting on to smart space, most solutions that are built in-house kind of looks like that. What we've done is try to steer away from these single use case deployments. So picture yourself, you got a team, you've got a problem to solve, you build for a solution, you implement it, deploy it, move on to use case number 2, and you start all over again. That's typically what we're seeing is happening. So at SmartSpace, what we've built is a infrastructure deployment that sits in your organization. We're not a SaaS company. You go to Azure Marketplace, you find SmartSpace, click on it, agree, deploy, and everything deploys to your organization, including front end. We've got two UIs, one for admin, one for a simple chatbot interface. All the configuration sits behind it, all the search indexes you need, the model deployments, everything deploys into your Azure subscription. We have this concept of data spaces, and essentially what that does is allows you to hook up to your organizational data and provide all the authentication that you need. And one or more data spaces become a workspace, and essentially a workspace is a one-to-one relationship with a use case. So these are just some example workspaces that we have. Now, we've built SmartSpace to be model agnostic. So you can, in your LLM library, select any number of models that you want to use for your workspace. And you'll notice these little icons that come up here are where you choose a Hugging Face model that's available via the Azure integration. We actually auto-provision the virtual machine and deploy that model for you, and then as soon as it's ready, it'll just appear in your drop-down list for you to choose. So it's really it's a developer tool, but there's a lot of no-code features that we've built into it. Again, much like you've seen with the others, we provide sliders for you to adjust your parameters in a no-code fashion, and you can also adjust the system prompt at the top should you wish to do so. We are not really about chats. You can make a chatbot if you like, but we're about workspace automation. And what we like to promote is the ability for you to programmatically communicate and connect with any number of workspaces that you've created. So you can essentially make a workspace that solves for a particular use case and then fully automate that you don't even need an interface. So we provide all the APIs that allow you to do that. And this is just a view of our simple chatbot UI that gets deployed with SmartSpace, and an example use case where we've got a customer that has hardware products, and they just ask, well, what do I need to trim a tree? And it comes up with relevant products that are available from that supplier. I'll finish with this. Based on the risks that I've described today, and based on the effort, the expertise, the AI engineers, should you be doing this yourself, choose wisely between building and buying. If you want to build, sure, but just make sure you partner with someone that can help you navigate a lot of those risks that I described earlier. That's it for me.